All right, so it's official. It's Talking Trout, first episode of 2022. We got Jeff on to talk about fly fishing for steelhead. Excited to have you with us, Jeff. Just a reminder for folks, if you could make sure that you're muted when you're not speaking, and out of respect for Jeff and his presentation. He's got about maybe a 45 minute presentation I think he's going to go through. I'm going to ask folks, if you can, to save questions for the end. And if you look down on the bottom of your screen, you should see a little button that says chat, and feel free to click on that. And as a question comes to mind, feel free to type your question into the chat box, and I'll keep track of that. And towards the end of Jeff's presentation, we should have some time to go back and answer some of those questions. So without further ado, Jeff, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you, Mike. And thanks for inviting me. Thank you to everybody out there who joined in tonight to see this program. I have it titled up here, Fly Fishing for Steelhead, Migratory Rainbow Trout, if you prefer. I'm not a biologist or a fish manager. All I really am is a fisherman who has a great passion for these tributary species and the tributaries in which they're found. So let me tell you a little bit about myself. Again, my name's Jeff Treu. I've spent many years fly fishing since I've been a kid, actually. I've also spent several years as a board member of Central Wisconsin Trout Unlimited. I've been on the Lake Michigan Fishery Forum Committee for several years, and all of it in an attempt to bring awareness to what I really care about, which is trout, salmon, and the environments in which they're found. And tonight I get to share a little bit about one of my favorite passions, and that's fishing for these migratory species in our backyard, basically, tributaries of the Great Lakes. So this program started long time ago when I was just a kid, maybe 10 years old, growing up in a small central Wisconsin town near the town of Pine River, where my dad was postmaster. He used to drag a young kid along to work in the summer months when I was on vacation. And when he went to work at 6 in the morning, I went down to the local trout stream, the Pine River, and fished for trout, and would usually by noon, when he'd go home for lunch, have a stringer of trout, and we'd go home and I would clean him while he went back to work for the rest of the day. And that started me on a journey. I met a man who was a friend of my father's in Pine River, who one day invited me over to his porch and said, "Look, Jeff, I see you so enthusiastically walking here every day, going to catch trout. I have his name was Orville. I have a fly tying bench I built when I was younger, but he said, I'm now, 90 years old. I can no longer see." And he said, "I can't think of a better person to give this to." So like a kid in a candy store, I took on this fly tying bench and these empty cigar boxes full of fly tying materials. And it opened a world to me that's been a great passion ever since. The only problem I had is I knew nothing about tying flies or how to fly fish. And the other person that came to light there was a man named Arling, who owned a fly shop around Poisippi on the highway. And I thought to myself, I have to make a connection with this man. So being I was about 10, 11 years old, couldn't ride a bike on the highway, I was forced to walk cross country in the snow, and showed up at his shop one day. And I think he wondered where this kid in the snow came from. And once I explained to him what was going on, he was more than happy to help me out, get me started, and teach me a little bit about fly tying, teach me a little bit about fly casting, and of all things, the first trout I've ever caught on a fly rod on a Royal Coachman streamer was a golden trout, of all things, out of a pond he had behind his shop. Well, that brought me down a long road of fly fishing, and it is where we are tonight, doing this program about fly fishing for steelhead, Great Lakes tributary program. And again, I could have chose a number of different salmon species, 3 different salmon species that are in our tributary waters here. I could have chose Pacific salmon, that is. I could have chosen Atlantic salmon species that is around the Great Lakes, namely Lake Huron and its tributaries. Also Lake Superior. I could have chose coastal brook trout. I could have chose to talk about lake trout or brown trout, migratory brown trout. But for me, it was a bit of a no-brainer. This is the favorite of all of them for me, and this is the steelhead species that swims close to our backyards. And so hopefully through this program, I'm able to inspire some of you to get interested in these fisheries so close to home, and in essence are world-class. And one of my real purposes for this program is to hopefully create a larger advocacy for this fishery we have. It's come to my attention over the years that when I was involved in a Great Lakes Fishery Committee, Forum Committee, that a lot of that deals with the open water of the lakes. A lot of Trout Unlimited deals with a lot of the inland streams, and not that the tributaries don't have groups or organizations involved with them, but I always felt that if I could present it the right way and put an emphasis on the passion I have for these fish in these waters, possibly this user group could grow, and these tributaries would also have a strong voice. And whenever there's a strong voice and support for something, typically the impacts get much better, the habitat gets much better, and the fishery along the way improves. So with that being said, let me get started here and present to you what I as a fisherman know a little bit from spending quite a few years on these tributaries. So the first slide here, I wanted to start with a little history, and this is a historical turn of the century Michigan fish hatchery. Certainly hatcheries don't always have the best reputation, but in this case, and in a lot of the cases of some of our great fisheries in the world or around the world, including our brown trout here in this country, they all started right here in the fish hatchery. And so did the rainbows or steelhead of the Great Lakes. Began in a Michigan fish hatchery, actually in the year 1876, when the first fish arrived that were stocked into a Michigan tributary. And a little bit more on that as we go along here. Here's a very old map. Actually, this is labeled as the Huron Territory. So that tells you that this map doesn't even show the state of Wisconsin or Michigan yet. But why I chose this map had nothing to do with the timeline, but had to do with all these little rivulets and tributaries that are on this map around these Great Lakes. And you see many of them here connected to 3 of the lakes that I actually have fished a bit on. And Lake Michigan, Lake Superior, Lake Huron, you see all these tributary waters connecting. Many of these close to where we live. And then on top of that, in between each one of these, which are medium to larger rivers, some named, there's small little creeks and streams in here that aren't even on this map. So you can imagine the opportunity to fish some of these areas for some of these tributary species. Some famous tributary waters or rivers, the Brule River. Maybe many of you, probably many of you have fished the Bruhl, Northwest Wisconsin, known as the River of Presidents. 5 presidents have fished this river. The Bruhl is a unique river in that it has a unique amount of public access to this river, 44 miles of water, basically undammed other than the lamprey weir with fish passage, not only tributary species, but also native resident trout. And on top of that, has not been stocked for, I think, over 20 years now. This river is self-sustaining in the way of not only its resident trout populations, but also all its migratory species. Here is the next maybe famous tributary water you've heard of, Michigan's Asabo River. 2 things come to mind when I think of the Asabo. This is the river in 1876 where the first rainbows or steelhead strain of rainbows were stocked here into the Asabo. Again, well over 100 years ago. The Asabo also has a resident population of native fish, as well as stocked fishery. And one of the other things that this river is famous for, that I'm always happy to remind people of, especially in this case, a Trout Unlimited audience, this is the founding waters right here of Trout Unlimited, the Asabo River, and plays right into my program. TU founded on a tributary stream. Very advantageous for me to talk about that the rest of the way here, and part of my attempt to bring to the forefront, you know, how wonderful these rivers are so close to home. Okay, here's a picture of a leaping steelhead, and the heading here is the best of the fresh. And what I'm implying here, is this the best of the freshwater fish as far as a sport fish we have close to home? Certainly I could get a lot of argument about that from muskie fishermen and smallmouth bass fishermen, probably from king or Chinook salmon fishermen, and certainly from Atlantic salmon fishermen, which we also have in the Great Lakes. But that being said, I have actually been fortunate enough to catch all of them. And from my perspective, this is a very unique fish that fills out the resume better than the rest, because this fish provides everything an angler could look for on the end of a fly line, and that being a drag that screams when this fish makes an electric run, the power of the fish, the acrobatics of the fish, and if you're not careful, the knuckle busting real handle ability of this fish. And for me, very special fish. I take pictures of the ones I catch, and I can look back at those pictures and remember each fish and each place I caught it, and how the memory unfolded. And for me, each and every one I catch is as special as the first one. And with that, I'll try and go ahead here and convince you possibly of the same at some point. Year-round Great Lakes fishery. Our tributary waters in many cases are year-round fisheries. Certainly there's exceptions, the Brule River being one that closes typically November 15th and then opens again last Saturday in March. But most tributary waters are open year-round to the first dam or first impassable fish barrier. And that being said, you know, fall ushers in, let's start in August or September, fall ushers in the first round of Pacific salmon and Atlantic salmon in places into the rivers, along with migrating brook trout, like coastal brook trout in places. And then later into the season, you'll see brown trout and lake trout and steelhead show up in the fall. Although the only spring spawner of the bunch is the steelhead. The rest of them are all fall spawning fish. But this fishery can go right into winter. I fished it into January, many times even February, depending upon open water that you can find. And then, you know, end of February, March ushers in spring season. And in spring, you know, we start to see these steelhead runs start to show up already as early as the end of February. And then some places go even into June, depending upon the place you're fishing. And then June rounds out probably the end of steelhead migration, but starts again other species like coastal brook trout and Atlantic salmon in places that offer a summer fishery, along with a Skamania strain of fish of steelhead that can offer a summer fishery. And pretty soon we're back to fall again. So year-round Great Lakes fishery, really advantageous for some of us here that usually put our fly fishing gear away as early as middle of October sometimes. So fall and winter fly fishing strategies. One thing just to notice here as I go on is obviously the snow cover, the cold weather, which requires special equipment, a little bit more on this collapsible net I have on with a strap on it a little bit later, versus spring and summer strategies. This is actually a photo of me up at Sault Ste. Marie. I'm actually on the Canadian side. That's the city of Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, Canada. On the background, you see the green foliage, pleasant weather, and pleasant fishing, a little different in the way of strategies. Maybe the most important, significant thing I'll talk about maybe all night long are water conditions when it comes to tributary and the species that are in them. Everything revolves around water conditions when you fish these tributary streams. These fish are not landlocked like is the case in a lot of inland streams. So conditions really dictate fishing opportunity. Here you see a picture of me on the Brule River. Here you see a clay bank. Here you see raindrops. And hopefully you can see the brown chocolate color of the water here. So water conditions can be everything, make a huge difference for this type of fishery. And when I speak of water conditions, I'm talking about flow, clarity, and temperatures. And when I say this, flow may be the most important of all, because precipitation is what starts everything going. So if we have a rain event and we have several inches of rain, whether it be fall or spring, that brings up these flows. And when these flows are brought up, that's when these fish start to enter the river. So it's kind of like a double-edged sword. Flow is a wonderful thing for bringing fish into the system, just like lack of precipitation and lack of flow means you have a river sometimes that's almost barren of fish in some cases. So flow is a wonderful thing, but with flow, especially a lot of it, comes challenges for the fishermen, obviously wading challenges, but also clarity challenges. And when these rivers start to rise, not only do these fish enter these rivers, but a lot of debris can wash in, a lot of clay. So unless you have a really nice, substrate of rock and gravel in rivers that won't get quite as mucked up, certainly clarity plays a big part. And typically as the water's going up, clarity is going down. Once the river peaks, CFS peaks, water starts to come down, usually within a few days after that, clarity starts to get better. And sometimes that can be some of your peak fishing opportunities. Now, I just want to quickly mention, there is a little bit of a way to cheat all of this. And what I learned long ago is to become very dependent on USGS water flow data, especially if you know a river well, or even if you don't know a river well, you can fish a river for the first time and you can say, wow, that river really fished good today. I mean, the water conditions seemed perfect. The levels seemed perfect, not too low, high enough. There were plenty of fish around. Clarity was pretty good. And what you can end up doing is you can go home that evening and check the USGS charts and see, where was that river at? Was that river at 400 CFS? Was that river at 1500 CFS, depending upon the size of the river? And that gives you a starting point, especially when you're planning a 2 or 3 hour trip to fish somewhere, as to whether or not you really want to do it based on what the USGS charts are saying. Now, some of the streams I fish are small, are in the UP, and many of them don't have a USGS chart or graph listed for them. But what you can do in that case, typically there's another larger river somewhere in the same water basin, or at least within a few short miles. And typically you can check that USGS site. And how I do that is, let's say I'm fishing a very small stream in the UP. It fished really well. It's the first time I fished at water level. It seemed a little high, but good. I can check another stream nearby that's bigger, that does have a chart, look at that CFS, even if it says 2,500 and it's a much bigger river. I know that when that river is at 2,500 CFS, it's probably pretty close to the same area that when precipitation falls, it shouldn't be that different in rainfall area. So that river, in a way, gives me a gauge as to what the other river might be doing as far as fishability. So just a little tip sometimes, at least for me, USGS charts and flow rates have really saved the day a lot of times. One other thing I have listed here is temps. And I'm talking here both about water temps and air temps. So typically in the fall season, water temps are obviously falling as the season progresses towards winter. In the spring, just the opposite. Water temps are rising as spring, moves towards summer, and a little bit different effect on the fish. One thing I will say is, for steelhead or most tributary trout or salmon, preferred temps are maybe in the 40 to 50 degree range, with 65 being about upper end, and maybe 33, 34 just above freezing being the lower end. And so with that in mind, when you're fishing for fish in really cold water, first thing you want to know is fish don't really come to the fly that much when water is that cold. You have to take the fly to the fish. And there's some things I'll talk about a little bit later pertaining to that. But also, when you have nights that are really cold in the fall, and you have nights that get down to 22 or 18 degrees or whatever, a really good move is not to get on the water first thing in the morning. That water now in the morning is as cold as it's going to be all day long. But sometimes if you wait till the afternoon, early afternoon, the sun has been out a little bit, warm in the water, and actually a warm sunny day in cold weather conditions can provide some pretty good tributary fishing in the afternoons. Vice versa, when the weather is really warm, those early morning, late evening times are when you might want to be on the water, because the heat of the day is just a little too much and has warmed the water up too much. So just something to keep in mind with water temps versus air temperatures. Other factors that affect tributary fishing, one of them, a really big one, is the fall salmon spawn, where that is prevalent on some of these tributary streams. And the reason for that, of course, is when there are a lot of salmon in the river, there are a lot of eggs in the river. And of course, eggs are a favorite food source of many migratory species, and especially steelhead. I don't know if there's anything a steelhead likes more than eating eggs. And in this photo here, you also see a dead salmon, and a little bit more about that in a minute. But another food source that these tributaries all offer, aquatic insect life. And as far as aquatic insect life, one thing I think over the years that I've seen is rivers with natural reproduction, like say the Brule River that has natural reproduction going on, and some of these small fry or par, smolt in these rivers and spend up to 1, 2, maybe even 3 years sometimes in these rivers. When they come back as adults, they really seem to zero in on fly patterns that look like nymphs or caddis pupa. Anything that resembles some of this natural food that they are so used to eating growing up in those rivers. Decaying salmon, I'd mentioned that slide or two before. Quick story here on the decaying salmon. I once had a friend tell me several years back that he'd been doing really well fishing blue eggs, of all things, blue egg patterns for steelhead. And I said, oh, that's interesting. And didn't give it much thought. I think in the back of my mind, I just kind of filed that as, yeah, steelhead are always attracted to bright colors. And a few days later, I was fishing a situation kind of similar to this, a riffle, shallow riffle. I was swinging a fly. The way I prefer to fish is swinging flies or stripping screamers. And basically to no avail, not much was going on. So I just timed to think, and I looked at my feet, and there was a dead salmon laying in the shallow water here with water running over it. As I watched it for a short time, I saw numerous pieces break off the size of maybe a small pearl and float downstream. And many of them were grayish blue color. And of course, then the light bulb went on that no wonder this friend of mine had been doing so well on a blue egg pattern. And so sometimes matching the hatch, even in a situation like that, as you observe some things, you see different ways of fishing that could help you be much more productive on some of these streams. Sculpins and shiners, most of these tributaries do have sculpin shiner populations along with other bait fish. I do like to fish a lot of bait fish fly patterns, and they've served me well over the years. Again, I think in some respects, some of these stock fisheries, these fish respond really well to bait fish patterns because they don't spend a lot of time in the river. The river warms too much in the summer months. So many of these fish are only in the river in the cold water periods of the year. And many of these fish not only eat these bait fish patterns in the stream, but they are used to feeding on gobies and smelt and alewife out in the lakes. So many times a bait fish pattern can actually be matching the hatch depending upon where you're fishing and what species you're fishing for. Just a quick thought on steelhead here. They have absolutely no aversion when they're spawning to eat their own eggs. So again, egg patterns are again come into play when steelhead are spawning. And overlapping the steelhead spawn is the sucker spawn. Here you see little glimpses of orange sucker egg clusters in the water. And again, steelhead have a great aversion to eggs. And if you are a indicator fisherman who likes to use an egg pattern or a nymph pattern, sometimes it can be very effective under these conditions. Maybe something you've never given much thought to. I certainly haven't until somebody told me about it when I was fishing up at the Sioux, that in early spring to mid-spring, there's a great bite on alvin and par patterns. And the reason why is because the St. Mary's River up there has good natural reproduction of salmon and their steelhead and along with other trout species. And in the spring, these little alvin and little salmon par are all over, and fish feed on them readily. So something to keep in mind, again, matching the hatch with your fly patterns when you're fishing some of these places based on what's going on these different systems. Weather, always a consideration when you're talking about conditions that affect fishing on these tributaries. This is actually a picture of me up at the Sioux. It's actually spring, middle of a snowstorm. And this slide is the dreaded picture we've seen in sporting magazines and other places, maybe even encountered. And the heading here is probably the most important factor, is fishing pressure. There's probably no factor contributing to a negative effect on tributary fish as fishing pressure. And that might be for fish in general. This obviously to me looks like a spawning run here. And these fishermen more than likely not only can see most of their fish, but have been fishing for them repeatedly. These fish probably aren't even biting anymore. They're probably in jeopardy of being foul hooked more than they are of actually taking a fly at this point with this pressure. Not only this many fishermen, but so visible. So you see something like this, or if I do anyhow, I avoid it. I walk somewhere where there's nothing like this going on, even if it means walking to a part of the river that's a long walk and maybe not as productive, but I still know my chances are probably better. And certainly there's ways to approach some of these areas. Let's say, you have to fish somewhere nearby because of public land versus private land access. You certainly can fish different times of the day, different days of the week, different angles, different flies, different speeds. There's always a way to get around pressured fish, but typically the best way is just to stay away from these types of areas, because most of these fish here are probably in a very negative mood when it comes to biting. A little bit on equipment. Here you see this ice buildup on the spay rod. Sometimes some of the best fishing on the trips is during some of the worst weather. Mike mentioned that in the beginning. So equipment comes into play, whether you're a two-handed aficionado or a traditional single-hand guy. One thing you have to keep in mind is to have plenty of backing and room on these reels for backing, because some of these fish can be very hot and very large and can get you into your backing in a hurry. Typical 7 to 8 weight single or two-handed rods are the norm on a lot of these tributaries. A little bit more on tips, tippet material. Tips, by that I mean sink tips. Years ago, I used to fish a lot of weighted flies, and it's still very effective on a floating line and a long leader in some situations. But over the last several years, many years already actually, sink tips are the way I fish a lot of cold water situations where I want to get the fly down to the fish in a hurry. I'm a believer in unweighted fly moves more naturally in the water on a 3 or 4 foot leader behind the sink tip, and I think it's a little bit more effective. Here we have some fluorocarbon, which can be very useful in low water, clear water conditions where you want a more invisible quality, especially on pressured fish. But for me, the standard is this Maximus stuff. And again, I'm not promoting it because I own any stock or anything, but this stuff here is amazing. The price is inexpensive, it's durable, and you can certainly, downgrade as far as, or downsize as far as poundage if you're fishing clear water. I typically fish about 10-pound test on the end piece of tippet on my leaders, and you certainly can go up or down depending upon the size of the fish, the river, and water conditions. But this is great stuff for migratory species, especially steelhead. Flies. Well, being a fly tyer, I had to be careful here. I don't go too long on this, but there are a lot of options here. I'm a streamer guy. I love fishing streamers. I really love swinging spay flies. I love, traditional flies, tube flies. And of course, there are other flies here I'm going to talk about too that can be very productive when it comes to fishing these tributaries, especially for steelhead. So here's a couple photos. Here's some attractor bright streamers, baitfish type streamers. Here are some large articulated streamers, really good patterns when you're targeting big migratory brown trout. Difficult almost to fish too big of a fly for a migratory brown trout. Here are more match to hatch style streamers, smelt patterns. Here are some of those par patterns with par markings. Here are a few orange bellied alvin patterns. A lot of options if you're a fly tyer. And a big part of the enjoyment of fishing these tributaries is, of course, using flies you tie. Some spay flies here, tied with more longer material for movement and brighter colors. Again, just another way of approaching fishing for steelhead. I guess I would say the fly choice is probably more determined by your fishing style than it actually is by the fish's preference, because when fish are active, sometimes as long as you're fishing correctly, the pattern isn't as likely to affect you as a fish in a negative mood versus a fish that's ready to be involved in taking a fly because it's active. So I'm just pointing here at this tube fly. Here we have several other tube flies that are tied like streamers, some tied as spay patterns. I find myself using tube flies more and more just because they're practical, they're durable, and I like the option of the simplicity of tying them without having to attach a hook. So I actually string them on my tippet material. These are flies I typically do not use very often, and yet they are maybe the most productive of all steelhead patterns: egg patterns, soft tackle patterns, spawn patterns, nymph patterns. Possibly under an indicator, possibly one of the best presentations, maybe most productive presentations for fishing for steelhead. I'm not really an indicator or a nymph fisherman very often, but if you are, and if you really are looking to up your odds or success, this is possibly, at least on certain days and certain times, about as productive of a way and productive choice of patterns as you could use sometimes when targeting tributary fish, especially steelhead. And I finish off here with traditional patterns. I fish them, especially where Atlantic salmon are around with steelhead, like up at Sioux. Not only that, but they're fun to tie. And these patterns, although old, still account for a lot of fish if you put in the time to use them. So I'll touch a little bit on this. I have very little experience with it, but out west especially, and where you have summer runs of steelhead, wakers and skaters fished across and downstream on the surface, making a commotion is an elite way of fishing for steelhead on the surface in many situations. And many fishermen, true purists in the sense of the word, prefer to fish only this way for summer run steelhead. Again, its limitations are mostly with warmer water conditions, but as exciting as it gets as far as fly fishing for steelhead. I put this box of flies in here. This is more traditional patterns like wolf patterns and irresistible patterns. Just to mention a little bit about fishing traditionally for steelhead, casting upstream with a downstream drift, prospecting for steelhead, working your way upstream as you would with maybe a royal wolf on a trout stream. And this pattern, especially this steelhead B, was made popular by Roderick A. Brown, who fished a summer run of steelhead in his native Vancouver area and did exceptionally well in the summer months fishing a dry fly, just prospecting for steelhead, and caught many. And his theory was that this bee-colored brown and yellow was a very natural bug in the water, whether it was a wasp or a bee, and fish had a hard time resisting it. So if you're a purist, certainly in the right place and the right time, dry fly fishing for steelhead is also an option. To round this fly section out, maybe the most fun is just coming up with some of your own variations of a D fly here or of a spay fly here, or of, this is actually my version, a spay version of a gray ghost pattern here with some spay hackle on it and a big zonker strip. But these flies are all effective if fished at the right time in the right place. And for me, there's great reward, I guess, catching fish on patterns that I tie or put together. Some other considerations, I talked a little bit about that collapsible landing net. Really nice to have in high water conditions or cold water conditions when you're not really looking to dip your hand into 33-degree water to try and tail a fish. That being said, waterproof gloves, although I myself prefer a fingerless rag wool glove, but in a lot of situations it is so cold or people's hands are cold enough that a waterproof glove is the way to go in some of these cold water conditions. And over here we find maybe, to me, one of the greatest items for a cold water steelhead fisherman, and that is the boot foot breathable wader. For years, I just had to get out of the water because my toes were froze, and this will absolutely keep that from happening and make your fishing much more enjoyable when you are in very cold water or very cold times of the year chasing those steelhead. So to continue on here as we're winding down to the end of this presentation, once on the water, where do you start? Well, this is the Michipicoten River, north shore of Lake Superior, Canadian side. You can see this is a large western looking river. A friend of mine, Vic, way out here, it's just a small dot. It can be overwhelming sometimes when you're looking at this stretch of water that's this big, but if you just break this water down into small segments, maybe fish it as if it was 3 or 4 smaller streams instead of one large stream, and try and cover everything thoroughly, you should be just fine. And for me, I actually enjoy fishing this bigger water. Everything is bigger. The eddies are bigger, the runs are bigger and deeper, and usually the fish are bigger too, which is a big bonus. So river mouths, classic spot to fish for steelhead or any migratory fish for that matter. Many times these fish will stage in river mouths or out in the lake where this current flows out into the lake. This is actually river mouth of Huron River up in the UP. Here are waves washing in. Right here is the beach from Lake Superior. And this river actually will flow with stained water out into the lake. You'll see this colored water streak go way out into the lake, and that's all fishable as well. And sometimes these can be great spots to target migratory fish when they're staging to enter rivers. Here's actually a steelhead caught out in the lake flow of the mouth of Fisher's Creek. Not even in the mouth, but actually where the current flowed into the lake. Next slide here is shallow riffles and rapids. Always a classic spot to find steelhead, Atlantic salmon fish, coastal brook trout fish that like faster currents. Certainly these current seams up through here, travel corridors, any of these softer seams working their way through are always areas to target. And then of course, if there are salmon in here, up here, then there are eggs coming down here, and certainly fish could be feeding in these deeper pockets. One word of caution, if you are fishing a stream like this that has natural reproduction going on, certainly you don't want to harass any spawning fish, and most certainly you don't want to be walking through any of their beds where the eggs may have been laid. So always caution when fish are spawning, especially in streams that basically are dependent on their natural yearly natural reproduction escapement. So just something to keep in mind there. A bright steelhead from some fast water. This is one of my favorite runs. This is actually a run up on the Whitefish River in UP, Michigan. You see this ledge rock coming down. You see this perfect uniform current, which is about the right speed for steelhead and other migratory species. You see the depth of this run. And then the big bonus are these big boulders you see in here. So something like this is just for me, a no-brainer. I look for runs like this. They're my favorite places to fish because the current isn't complicated. I would not pass a run like this, and I would not fish it once. I'd fish it maybe through once with one fly pattern, come back through a second time with another fly pattern. And if I think it's productive, or if I think there has to be fish in there, I may even try and fish it a different way a third time through. But good looking water like this, it has to be explored and should never be passed up. Nice bright chrome steelhead from a run. Actually, this was a Sheboygan fish. Here's a big deep pool. This is complicated water here. This is a huge pool on the Brule River. This pool, this is the inside bend over here, the slack water. This pool comes across here, is deep all the way, and then it goes around this point and goes along behind this point over here. And so it narrows out over here and gets deep with some good flow. And up here, this is the head of the pool, shallower water dumping into deeper water here. Over here, you have a big eddy and some slack deep water here. So this becomes real difficult to fish. But no doubt there are fish here. So best way to approach this is to try and fish this segment by segment, concentrate on this eddy, then maybe try and wade deep and concentrate on this water the other side of the eddy. As you get down here, the water slows. You may have to even strip some of this if it's too slow. And then as it gets around the bend over here, it gets deep and picks up some speed. So you may even have to put a weighted fly on or change your tip to get down deeper. But the best way to fish some of this complicated water that has 4 or 5 different things going on is, again, to break it into segments and try and fish it as individual little pieces of water. Again, great spot for fish to hold, but sometimes difficult to get them out of this type of water. Fish out of a deep hole. So here's another, I would describe this as a double-edged sword when it comes to steelhead fishing. Great spot for steelhead to congregate, dam sites, especially when there's no fish passage. So these areas always hold fish, but they also always hold fishermen, and sometimes lots of them. So I myself avoid these areas quite often, but there are times when the weather is inclement, heavy rain, or late in the season when it's cold, that you can actually get to some of these places and fish them without much pressure. Sometimes when the river is really high, fishermen stay away, and they know that the river is muddy and unwadeable, but sometimes these dam areas can be the only places available for fishing under those situations. Here's a dart fish that was in the river for quite a while. Obviously, this is a dam fish. The actual catching part. So maybe this is really what the program is all about, beyond the passion I'm trying to invoke and the interest I'm trying to invoke in our local tributary streams, is the actual fishing of these streams. And this is a great photo. I love this photo with this moss-colored ledge rock and ice coming down through here. You see the ledge rock in the water here, and then you see this crevice, this dark crevice right through here. And really, this guy here fishing a slackline indicator rig, I mean, it couldn't be any better, because this would be really difficult to target with a streamer or a spay fly, being it's so narrow and deep and shallow on both sides. But this indicator with a nymph or an egg underneath, or both, floating slowly right down this slot, is a perfect presentation. And so drift fishing with an indicator certainly is a productive way to fish. And sometimes in some situations like this, it's the perfect way to fish. Ice stick nymphing, many of you that fish inland streams are familiar with this. Of course, it works just as well for steelhead and tributary species. The water is just a little bigger. The run is just a little bigger usually. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes the water is pretty small. But again, another situation where minus the indicator, you can start at the head of the run, high stick it into shallow water, lower your rod as you get into the deeper part of the run. And when you come to the tail out, start raising your rod up again, and lies in ring maneuver, making your nymph look like possibly an emerging nymph, and a very effective way to fish for steelhead. swing the fly. This is, of course, I'm a little bit biased. This is my favorite way to fish. Great photo here, kind of a aerial photo looking down on this fisherman. Here he has this beautiful run of deep water, hydro cushion here in front of the rocks and the tail out, and pocket behind the rocks. And then when that fly comes around, you're going to have a dangle or hang down area here. And a dangle or hang down area is nothing more than when your fly comes across an area where the swing ends and you just leave that fly hang down or dangle there for a few seconds before you do anything, in hope that a fish followed it across to this point and is now looking at it. And in a matter of seconds, this fly is too enticing for this fish to pass up, and hopefully we'll take it at that point. But two things I notice here, since I don't know what's actually happening or who this fisherman is, but this you could call it drag in his line or this intentional bow in his line. If he is fishing a grease line method, casting straight across with a floating line, he probably wants this intentional bow in his line because he's using a floating line with a long leader, a fly that might only be inches under the surface, and he's trying to keep that fly broadside to the fish that are in this run here as long as possible. And so he may even put a downstream mend in at this point to try and keep that fly broadside as it comes around here down into the dangle. Now, if he is fishing a downstream swing, he may have just cast this fly now on a 45-degree angle downstream, and he has yet to mend the line upstream yet. But irregardless, typically a grease line fishing situation involves warmer water, floating line, longer leader with a fly submerged, which is only a few inches under the water, in warmer water conditions where fish will actually come to the fly. And a downstream swing tactic is used more where you're using a sink tip and possibly fishing colder water where you need to get the fly to the fish. It presents the fly from more of a back view, but both can be equally effective depending on the conditions, water conditions, temperatures, etc. So great photo here, great run, and irregardless of what he's doing, it's a great example of how you can approach a run like this when you're fly fishing on the trims. Here is a very short video of a good friend of mine. His name is Tom. He is spey casting and fishing a slow, deep run. And obviously it's cold. You can tell by the warm gear he's got on. Trees are bare. Here's some ice, looks like foliage is dead. So let's take a look and see what Tom is doing here. He's doing something a little different than most of us are taught to do. And what that is we step as we work down a stream. We cast, we step downstream, we swing or cast again, step downstream, and repeat the process. Tom is doing it a little different here, and I'll point it out as he goes along. So he's retrieving his fly after the swing here to make a snap T spey cast to present the fly from upstream. Comes across, goes out on a 45, mends his line, and now he takes that step downstream. And the advantage there is in this cold water is to just sink that fly a little deeper than he's already sunk it, because those fish are on the bottom and not going to move far for that fly. So by him taking that step down after he presents the cast or the fly, instead of before, he can fish it just a little deeper and slower, which might make the difference. He came across to the dangle there, waited a few seconds. Now he's getting a fine position to make another cast, known as a snap T cast. Comes around, 45 down. Here's his mend, there's his step downstream, repeats the process. So great way to approach fishing a deep, slow run, especially when you know the water's cold and fish aren't going to move far. Stripping streamers. Typically, I don't strip streamers a lot other than in slow frog water. And when the river isn't really moving my fly, then I move it. And this is a perfect example of a deep, slow hole with current edge over here on the white bubble line. Here you see a lot of silt stirred up from me waiting. But stripping streamers in these situations in these slow holes can be very effective for migratory fish, especially late in the season when the water is cold just before ice up. These are the areas where fish congregate in these slow, deep holes. And stripping streamers sometimes is the way to catch those fish, whether you're using a short, steady strip with a pause in between. And typically the colder the weather and the colder the water, the longer the pause. You can speed up the whole process when the water is a little warmer. But again, very effective way to target migratory species, especially steelhead on some of these migratory species, streams, or tributaries. Dry fly swing, skating, and waking. I talked a little bit about that again. You're presenting these flies when you're skating them or waking them in a similar fashion as when you're skittering a caddis on the surface. Across and down, here you see some commotion where the fly is waking. And as it travels across with the right situation, right water temps, especially with summer run steelhead, these fish will come to the surface and take these flies right off the surface. Have not done a lot of that, but how exciting that must be. As I wind this down here and about ready to come to an end shortly, I just want to talk a little bit again. I'm talking from my experience as a fisherman. I certainly am not an expert on any of this, but a lot of these streams on the east shore of Wisconsin on Lake Michigan have lots of dams, lots of warm water issues, habitat issues. And so a lot of these streams are stocked fisheries because of some of the habitat damage that's been done over hundreds of years already on these streams. But some of these dams also do not have fish passage. So short distance from the lake to some of these places for these fish to get to. And again, many variables to consider here. But one of the problems with these types of streams is there's virtually no reproduction going on, and without some stocking going on, some of these streams would virtually have no fisheries at all. Flip side of that is this picture here. This is actually a Stevens Point group from UW Stevens Point in a joint venture here with the DNR. And actually TU too, several of our chapters helped fund this natural reproduction study, pit tag and outbound survey that was done by these young college students from Stevens Point in an effort to determine if some of these smaller tributaries that weren't dammed and had good groundwater were reproducing or having any natural reproduction. And of course, surveys like this are important because if they can establish natural reproduction, then certainly habitat work can be done, and certainly possibly some safeguards in the way of regulation changes to protect these streams can be put into place, and natural reproduction can flourish in some of these areas. Certainly not very prevalent on the east shore of Wisconsin on Lake Michigan, but it can happen in some places. I know there's a few streams in Door County that actually have some decent natural reproduction. Fish hatcheries, possibly a controversial thing for some fishermen and maybe fish managers or organizations, but this is the Kettle Moraine Fish Hatchery, which has recently been renovated to a state-of-the-art steelhead hatchery. I will say this, that a lot of the streams I fish have no fishery at all if it doesn't begin here. And if you have fished some of the streams of Southwest Wisconsin, the White River, even some of the western streams, there is a good chance you've run into some hatchery fish in places. And I'm a proponent of wild and natural reproduction wherever possible, but I do believe there's a place for these hatcheries for supplemental fisheries that wouldn't exist without them, especially, as I said, in some of our streams here close to home. So why fish for steelhead? Well, several reasons. One of them is the solitude, and believe me, steelhead are not easy to catch, so you get a lot of solitude sometimes. And this is not always an easy sport if you're looking for fish numbers. So some of the places, though, that steelhead are found, like the Jack Pine River here on the north shore of Lake Superior, Canadian side, are such beautiful places that there's a lot to admire about fishing these spots. And of course, the bonus fish makes it all that much more better as you spend time in these areas. Here's a photo of another friend of mine fishing the Sheboygan River, springtime, grass is getting green, some leaves starting to grow, beautiful spring day. Hard to beat that when it comes to spending time on the water. A lot of the fishing I do beyond the reasons of just catching a steelhead, and some of it is these beautifully aesthetic places where steelhead live and can be found. The beauty, of course, this is fall colors. This is the Brule River. This is a photo of the Sioux and its rapids from the Canadian side, St. Mary's River, International Bridge here going from Canada, heading into upper Michigan, storm rolling in from the west in the evening, and umpteen opportunities of pocket water here, and just a great place to fish. And one of the best reasons for me, the camaraderie and the friendships. Some of my friends, lifelong friends, catching steelhead. I fish with many people, and it's always amazing to me. Some of them I actually met on the water and have been friends with ever since. It's always amazing to me the reaction a steelhead brings from a person. Here we see a friend of mine with a great smile. Here we see another friend with a smirk, and again, you can only imagine what he's thinking, but I'm sure he's pretty happy about that steelhead. Here's someone most of you know, Ira. Ira actually has a look of disbelief on his face. Wayne, our current chapter president, another smirk, and steelhead have that effect on people. Great fish. Here's a good friend of mine, Tom, with a smile big enough to match this beautiful steelhead he has. And another friend, Tom. Tom looks like he's maybe a little bit in shock, possibly his first steelhead, but I know he's grinning through and through. And Tom's brother, Tim, very serious, but I'm sure he's smiling on the inside. Nice big steelhead. Myself up at the Sioux with what could be a steelhead, but actually with all these spots here below the lateral line, it's also a possibility this is actually a resident rainbow. But either way, same subspecies, same fish actually spawned together, just difference in migration, that's all. But great fish nonetheless. And of course, the best reason to fish these tributaries, and the best reason, and I have steelhead here because this is a steelhead program. It could be a coastal brook trout, it could be an Atlantic salmon, it could be a large migratory brown. You take your pick. But for me, it's a steelhead, and this is such a great sport fish. And for me, the best description of this fish is a drag screaming, knuckle busting, cartwheeling, powerfully electric fish, world-class sport fish, a world-class sport fishery close to home. And I can guarantee you this guy has his rod doubled over, the steelhead is jumping, and his odds of landing this fish are maybe 50% at best. But either way, he'll never forget the thrill of this fish. And with that, we have the end. So I thank you for coming and tuning in to this program this hour of the evening, and hopefully you may have a few questions, and hopefully I at least covered one or two pointers that help you if you're interested in this type of fishery. Thank you again. Mike?
Hey, Jeff, that was great. Really, thanks for joining us tonight and sharing your knowledge. And do you mind sticking around a little bit? There were a couple of questions. You mind hanging out and answering a few of them?
Absolutely. I'm retired, Mike. I'm not going anywhere.
All right. I gotta say, you know, I was instantly taken aback to the last time that a fish took me into my backing, and it was a steelhead, and I was into my backing in no time. I couldn't believe it, and I did not land the fish, but you know, that experience just sticks with me, and I feel like I'm standing in the river right now, having that experience. Just it's right there. So they're such an amazing fish, and if folks haven't had a chance to have one on the end of their line, I'd highly encourage you to go out and take advantage of some of the opportunities that Jeff talked about that we do have here in Wisconsin. Real quick, can you run us through like your typical fly rod setup? Like if you're going out steelheading in Wisconsin, what weight rod are you using? Like how big's a reel? How much backing you're putting on there? Like line weight?
Well, it is really similar. It is really similar to fishing inland streams. Obviously, when you're fishing a small inland stream, you may be using a 4 or 3 weight. And when you're fishing a small tributary, you may be using a 5 or 6 weight rod, especially if you're using a switch rod or a spey rod. If you're using a single hand rod, it might be a 6 or 7 weight. You might go up 1 or 2 weights. If I'm fishing really big water, I might be fishing a 14-foot or larger spey rod. That might be a 9-10 weight. And again, it's similar to muskie fishing. You don't really need a big rod to land a muskie, but you need a big rod and gear to throw a muskie plug. And steelhead fishing sometimes falls in that category when you're fishing a big water, deep water, fast water, and you're throwing a heavy sink tip to get your fly down there. You need a big rig to operate more for what you're trying to accomplish than actually the fish itself.
Excellent. That's great. I know Craig chimed in a little bit earlier when you were talking about sinking lines versus sinking leaders, and the leader is kind of a neat thing. Craig mentioned that for some of our smaller streams, you don't really need the sink tip line. You can take your floating line that you have and just put one of those sinking leaders on there, and that'll help get you down probably what you need, the depth that you need, right?
Well, yeah, depth comes along with current speed and of course, size of the run you want to fish. So for me, and I think he may be talking about a poly leader or versa leader, which is a coated sinking leader versus a sink tip. And typically, and there's other forms of sinking leaders, but typically the problem with a poly leader or a versa leader, a coated leader, or a sinking leader is when I fish some of these streams, I'm fishing fairly large flies. And sometimes the flies are weighted. So typically a sink tip like T8, meaning 8 grains per foot. If you have 10 foot of T8, you have a 80 grain sinking tip, or T14, which is 14 grains per foot, and you have 140 grains of sinking tip if you're using a 10-foot leader. Typically, these heavier sink tips are much easier to turn over a heavy fly or a big fly, especially a large fly that might be waterlogged. So these sinking leaders are especially good if you're using medium to smaller flies. But if you start fishing bigger flies and bigger water, sometimes a true sinking tip versus a sinking leader like a poly leader comes into play. Of course, some of these sink tips are probably too big too for micro space. And again, that's another program if you want to get into different types of fly fishing equipment. But if you keep it simple and think of fishing inland streams, everything matches: small flies, small rod, small leader, small tips. And the bigger the fly you're using or the bigger the water you're fishing, sometimes you do require these sink tips instead of sinking leaders.
That makes sense. I know Craig was on and he mentioned, I know he fishes, areas in Southeast Wisconsin, Sheboygan, Milwaukee, and things like that quite a bit. And he's noticed in the last few years that it seems like the runs of browns and steelhead are coming later and later in the season. Is that something that you picked up on too here in Wisconsin, or
yeah, well, this year was
coincidence?
Exactly. No, that is right. This year was especially late. And in a lot of instances, we are now, you have to remember, a lot of these fish are stocked in these stocked fisheries that don't have natural reproduction, which is what we mostly fish here, at least from Green Bay south. In a lot of cases, there isn't a lot of natural reproduction. So a lot of these fish are stocked at 6 months or a year old. And those fish that were stocked at 6 months or a year old, it's really 3 or 4 years before we see those fish as adults. So depending upon that year class as to when they return to the river, also depending upon the fall. This fall, October was extremely warm, and we had king salmon in the rivers well into November, which usually are long perished by then. And we had coho showing up, deer season, Thanksgiving, and the fishery was really, really late this year because of the warm water. And the other thing is that was really detrimental this year was lack of water. And lack of water can delay everything significantly too. And I think then you have to put in some of the other variables of this fall, what year class of stocking fish are you fishing for from 3 years previous when they were stocked, and how many were stocked? Because many of our streams the returns are directly related to the stocking that goes on because of the lack of natural reproduction. So all of those variables come into play.
Yeah, those are good points. All right, so let's break it down. If you're a beginner or if you're somebody who wants to get into this, set the expectations for me. If I'm going to go spend a day or a weekend steelheading, Like, should I expect to land multiple fish in a day? Am I hoping to like touch one in a weekend? Like, or is it all over the place?
Yeah, it can be all over the place. There were times in the glory years back in the early 2000s and the 90s where I might have had a day where I caught as many as 11 or 12 steelhead in a day, but that only happened once or twice in my life. Most of the times that I go, I don't catch a steelhead at all in a day, and sometimes I don't catch a steelhead at all in a week. And so it is again dependent on what we were talking about, what happened 3 years prior, what time of year you're fishing. Steelhead fishing is typically best in the spring. You can catch steelhead in the fall and in the winter, but typically if you're really targeting steelhead, your best chance is in the spring. And certain waters and rivers are better than others. And so, and in certain fishing styles, I think I touched a little bit. I am not an indicator nymph egg guy, but typically if you're a beginner and you want to fish steelhead, that is really the way to go. And maybe even a small to medium stream that has a steelhead population is also a way to go, because that, of course, significantly reduces the water there is for you to fish, especially if you're a drift guy with an indicator, because that tight style of fishing really shines on those really small little creeks and rivers. And I can tell you, when these bigger rivers that I fish are blown out because of heavy precipitation, those little creeks that you can jump across, now they turn into small rivers and can be some of the best places to find steelhead. And with an indicator, with maybe a nymph and an egg under it, pretty hard to beat and pretty good way to start searching for steelhead as a beginner, I would say.
Yeah, that's great. I got an interesting question here. Someone was interested in getting back into steelheading, and they were wondering if you could recommend a guide for the Brule River. I know I think Damien and Luke are both out of the business now.
Right.
Some other ones up there?
And I'm kind of the wrong guy to ask about guides because I never hardly fish with them, but I do know both those guys. I would say the thing to do would be to contact Superior Fly Shop in Superior, Wisconsin. They deal with the guides that fish on the Bruhl, and I'm sure they could steer you in the right direction. It's also a great fly shop if you're in the area. It's only about 20 minutes from the Bruhl. Great fly shop to visit. Superior, I think it's called the Superior Angler, maybe. Fly shop.
Great tip. Somebody else mentioned here that we should lobby the DNR to increase the steelhead stocking. And I know that's something that comes up from time to time, well, more often than just time to time, but it kind of pits the tributary angler against sort of the I guess the commercial, maybe not the commercial fishermen, but like the charter boat captains and the folks who make a living taking people out on the big lake and catching big salmon. And there's only, like, we're all buying Great Lakes trout stamp, and there's a limited pot of money there to raise these fish and put them back into the lake. And but yeah, it makes a good point, and you certainly made some good points that this is a fishery. These are fisheries that are worth being a champion for, and we do need to be better advocates of our tributary streams.
Well, and I agree, and you're right. Wherever these fish exist, there are different user groups. There, of course, are the charter and commercial fishermen. There are the lake fishermen that have their own boats. There are the harbor fishermen and the pier fishermen and the wade fishermen. And of course, then there's the stream and tributary guides. And so there's always different user groups looking for different fish. As tributary guys, we really like the trout species because they don't die shortly after entering the river. They can actually go through the spawning mode, even though there's not much reproduction going on, head back out to the lake and return the next year. So, and for lake guys, they really like the salmon. And of course, the happy medium is to find everybody exactly what they want, but it doesn't always work like that. But I would say the last few years, returns to the river have been pretty meager. But the silver lining is that about 2 or 3 years ago, stocking was increased across the board. Skamania steelhead were reintroduced into the lake after VHS had put an end to that many years ago, I think in maybe 2013, I'm not sure. And along with that, brook trout have been reintroduced into the lake. And so the future should be bright, especially in the next couple of years. We should see tributary fishing I doubt it'll ever be like it once was, years ago when they were putting a million steelhead alone in the lake, let alone other species. But there is hope in the future here in the next 2 or 3 years that this increased stocking will pay dividends in the way of returns to these tributaries. And hopefully we'll see better fishing as the next 2 or 3 years unfold.
Well said. I think we're gonna leave it there tonight. That's a perfect way to end. And I don't know about everybody else, but I'm fired up to tie some flies and get out there this spring as soon as this cold weather breaks, and get out there and chase some steel. So thanks everybody for joining tonight. Stay safe out there. I should mention a housekeeping item. The state council decided to cancel our February banquet this year. We just felt with the increase in COVID cases right now that it wasn't the right time to hold a large in-person gathering. So that is off. If anybody had bought an early bird ticket and would like a refund, we are offering refunds. Just to get a hold of me, or we'll be getting a hold of you as we work our way through those folks who have already purchased tickets to make arrangements to get those funds back to you. But we hope to be back in 2023. But in the meantime, we have the steelhead season to look forward to, and if it warms up a little bit, in early inland trout season too. So hopefully you get out there and get into some fish, and we'll see you all soon. Okay. Thanks again, Jeff, for being on. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Mike. And thank you for everybody who checked out the program. Thank you again.
All right. Have a good night, everybody. Thanks for joining.